Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the EduSite Network. Our today's topic of discussion is Indian discourse of soft power in world politics. And for this lecture and discussion, we have with us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi, New Delhi. He has been teaching for the last 23 years and his area of specialization is Indian politics and political thought. And with this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Sir to our EduSite studio and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, madam. In fact, today's topic for our discussion is India's discourse of soft power in international affairs or world politics. Now, this theme of soft power is picking up momentum in recent years. Particularly in last few months, we have seen that even in India, this concept is gaining a new currency and new momentum. But for our listeners, I would like to just mention one thing, that India's engagement with soft power is not a new development. From the very beginning, India has been championing this cause in the world politics, so much so that at one point of time when the entire world was under the grip of Cold War, and Cold War essentially meant a kind of arms race, kind of power politics, India tried to preach and practice this discourse of soft power even at that time. And it was at that time that in fact Indian entire engagement was looked at with skepticism, because it is normally believed that international affairs and the world politics, they are run by by the calculation of power politics. In other words, it is called the realist calculation, that ultimately it is the power which matters. It is not the norms and the ethics in international relations which have much place in the discourse of the nation states. But in Indian context, in fact, at that time, it was both the realization of the world politics, on the correct assessment of the situation which was unfolding at that time, and secondly, because of our traditional ethical and the cultural milieu, in which I think this new discourse of soft power was basically propounded at that time by India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And in this context, I would like to mention the two important policy discourse, one can say. One was the non-aligned movement, another was the discourse of Panchashil. Of course, the Panchashil was between the two neighbors, India and China. But even in international politics, one can say that Panchashil also had similar ramifications which non-aligned movement had. So, these two, policy innovations, one can say, two, major interventions in world politics at that time, can be considered India's contribution, that how India looked at the global politics, how India tried to reshape the entire agenda of world politics, how India tried to show the entire world community that not only with the hard power discourse that the world politics could be seen and could be run. So that way one can say that this non-aligned movement and the Panchashil were the hallmarks of this discourse of soft power at one point of time from the point of view of Indian diplomacy and India's foreign policy. But over the years, this has been further fine-tuned, and we find that today, in the new context, this soft power is acquiring a new momentum, because all said and done, we are living in a global world, and this process of globalization, which was unleashed in 90s, has added new dimension to discourse of soft power. And recently, when India's Prime Minister, while addressing the United Nations, highlighted this dimension, that how this notion of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that entire world is one family, that has been the approach of India from the very beginning. So, that basically reinforces this view that India doesn't want to deviate from this discourse of soft power even in this globalized world, where ultimately the interests of various nation states matters, and there are number of channels, number of frameworks through which these interests are sought to be accomplished. But nonetheless, India wants to stick to its engagement with the soft power and then will try to protect its national interest. That is something quite significant in today's context. We will come to these two issues, that how India initially looked at this entire world politics, and how basically promoted this discourse of soft power through this non-alignment and the Panchasheel. But before that, let us have a look at on this notion of this soft power, because normally international relations, there are two types of assumptions which are considered to be axiomatic. One is that all nation states have a national interest and they would like to protect and promote it in the world politics. And number two, it is ultimately the power which matters, because only with the acquisition of power that a nation state attains respectability in world politics. So these are the two assumptions. Now there is no denying the fact that power matters in world politics, and every nation state seeks to basically augment its power, tries to acquire power, tries to basically increase the both quantity and quality of its power is in its possession. So that is there. But nonetheless, one thing should be very clear at the outset, that hard power cannot be effective in isolation. Always hard power requires the assistance of the soft power, because only with the help of the soft power that it can become a legitimate power among the actors of the world politics. So that's why this combination of hard and soft is very important. But the thing is that if a nation state tries to pursue only the hard power and ignore the soft power, then it becomes a temporary phenomenon. Its legitimacy in the world politics and legitimacy of its authority in the world politics will not prolong. Similarly, if a nation state ignores totally the hard power and focuses only on the soft power, even in that case, that will not be effective in basically promoting and basically enhancing the national interest of any country. So I think one thing is very important, that both powers have to exist side by side. Now the thing is that how that can happen, because ultimately when we talk of hard power, we essentially mean by hard power the military strength of the state. We mean the economic development, the economic growth, the economic affluence of the society, of the country, of the nation state. When we talk of hard power, we essentially mean number of institutional and the material features which go along with all these. So I mean, this is basically understanding of hard power. But when you come to soft power essentially implies a normative power. And in other words, one can say that this normative power is ethical power, but of course based on certain considerations which are societal, which are cultural, which are traditional, and which are heritage, part of the larger social and cultural heritage of a society or nation state. So that way, the soft power essentially goes in normally the non-material, but it is not so totally exclusive that it will be totally non-material, but nonetheless the non-material is perhaps the most important characteristic of the soft power. Now sometimes even the hard power is considered a normal power, and the soft power is considered as a normative power. So normative power versus normal power, this distinction also we find quite frequently in this discourse in international politics. Now when we talk of soft power, normally it is basically the strength of opinion of the forces of material forces. It is basically the kind of non-coercive and non-violent power of at the possession of the nation state. It is totally non-coercive. It is not that it is on basis of the fear which normally the hard power or normal power generates in the minds of the adversaries or even non-adversaries. Even that dimension is totally missing in this conception of normal power. So it is non-coercive and at the same time non-violent, because the means are very important for this notion of normative power, that is the soft power, because the moment the means become violent, I think that will be counterproductive. Then you cannot talk of a normative power. So it has to be non-coercive and non-violent. Now therefore, what becomes important here is the concept of rule of law. What becomes important here is democracy. What becomes important here is that basically all those considerations which go beyond the Westphalian conventions, because the modern nation state owes its origin to the the Westphalian treaty. So all those considerations which are beyond these conventions and these treaties are normally put in the realm of this soft power. Now when we come to this normative dimension, in fact, the most essential features of this normative, discourse is the concept of peace, liberty, justice, human rights, and so on and so forth. In recent years, we have seen that some new dimensions are also being, talked of, and those dimensions include anti-discrimination. We talk of sustainable development. We even talk of good governance. So these aspects are the part of the soft power, that how they can be practiced in a particular given context, and how these practices and how these principles can be packaged and how they can be put before the larger community of the world, that these are the true values for which human beings should strive for. These are the values for a nation, for which the nation state should essentially work for. So I mean, this way it is basically attempted to provide that not only with the crass materialism, with the material power, with the growth, with the military might, that a nation state can acquire legitimacy, a kind of a stature in the world politics, but a nation state can acquire a stature in world politics also on basis of certain other considerations which are ethical in nature. For example, the track record of a nation state in preserving and practicing democracy can be a very important instrument to at least promote this notion of soft power, because if entire world community is aspiration is for equality, then perhaps democracy can be a very important instrument to bring this equitable social order, both inside and outside, and therefore this democracy can be an important instrument. Similarly, there are other features which go along with democracy. For example, the quest for liberty, equality, and justice. This is a quest, modern quest of human beings, and how the particular country has been attempting or trying to basically put all these values in practice through its good governance, through its democratic governance. I mean, all these things can go a long way in promoting this notion of the soft power. And soft power, in other words, one can say that increase the legitimacy of the nation state, can give more weightage to its voice in the world politics, that a particular nation state is can command respect on the world fora, not on basis of simply the growth in its economy, not simply on basis of the armaments which it possesses, not on basis of the military might it commands, but on basis of these values, that how it has been basically practicing within its domestic context, and how those values it is basically championing in world affairs. So I mean, this way one can see this entire discourse of soft power as a very important instrument and tool in world politics, and it is emerging now. It is being realized even those realists, because it is a classical debate in international politics that what matters, the national interest or ideology. I mean, the entire division between the idealists and the realists. The realists always believe that nation states, for nation states only the power matters, only the interest matters. The ethics and morality, they don't have much place in world politics. Ultimately, a nation state commands respect in international community not on basis of the ethics it preaches, the morality it talks of, but on basis of the power it possesses. So this is a realist framework, and then the idealists have always been talking about this ethical dimension of power and ethical dimension of politics. Now, but even now, what we find today, that even the hardcore realists have started realizing the limitation of this normal power, because the normal power, as I mentioned, which is sometimes coterminous with notion of the hard power, because they cannot, the hard power or the normal power cannot at its own command that legitimacy, cannot become a basis for any nation state to command respect and kind of authority in world politics. Therefore, it always needs a support, it always needs an ethical framework under which it can operate, and therefore its growing salience and importance. Now, it is here that India stands out. It is here the contributions of India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru should be remembered and should be discussed. That what was the context in which India talked of this soft power, the normative power. And as I mentioned earlier, the two discourses, the discourse of non-alignment and Panchashila, stand out in this context. One was basically a kind of movement which involved countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. the three continents which witnessed a long period of colonialism, and these countries were underdeveloped, reeling under poverty, and therefore these countries had to basically find out a place in world politics. So it was in this context this entire discourse of non-alignment emerged, and with hindsight one can say that this non-alignment was not only a compulsion but sometimes a very well informed, well considered judgment on the part of the many countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America. And one can, from the framework of this soft power, one can even say that this non-alignment was basically a discourse of soft power from the point of view of world politics. Now, another thing which I mentioned, that Panchasheel, it essentially emerged in context of China, Indo-China relationship. But nonetheless, this entire framework of peaceful coexistence was a very important principle through which India and China tried to demonstrate at that time to the world community that how two neighbors can have this type of framework to settle their disputes. Of course, the Panchasheel ran into trouble after 62 Chinese aggression, and after a few years it was basically not renewed also. But again, with the new context, when we find that Indo-China relationship is entering into new phase, when we are talking of the two Asian countries likely to emerge as perhaps the superpowers in 21st century, so much so that people have started talking of 21st century as the Asian century, that this century remembered for the power of the Asian states, nation states. So that way I think even Panchasheel, the principle of Panchasheel as a discourse of soft power is important. But let's begin with first of all this non-aligned movement as a discourse of soft power. Now one thing is very clear, that India from the very beginning recognized two things: the importance of democracy, the importance of non-violence as an instrument for politics, and also recognize this diversity of society as a very important component of any meaningful discourse in politics. Now this diversity, both inside and outside, was an important dimension of India's foreign policy from the very beginning. And secondly, this non-violence, the peaceful coexistence, the mutuality of interests, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, all these features basically informed India's foreign policy from the very beginning. So much so that even India's constitution, when Article 51 talks of duties, and those duties are basically promoting peace, good relations with countries, believing in international law, and arbitration and settlement of all disputes through peaceful means. So constitutional sanctity of these principles one can see through this Article 51 of Indian Constitution. So it was not only a political rhetoric, it was not only political discourse, but it was in fact a constitutional principle, and therefore it has some sort of legality from the point of view of law and jurisprudence. Now what we find, that India's foreign policy therefore, when it was basically formulated in the formative phase of Indian journey towards its statehood, particularly after India's independence in 1947, and one of the famous speeches which India's first Prime Minister Nehru delivered on All India Radio in 1947 September, that is considered perhaps the foundation of India's foreign policy. Now in that speech itself, all these principles flow from that that representation of India's Prime Minister. Now as it is well known that India's foreign policy is based on certain principles. It is not something which is without principles. There are objectives, but objectives and principles have been tied in such a manner that they appear that they are basically coterminous with each other. Now the principles, important principles, are basically anti-colonialism, anti-racism, basically a kind of special bias for the Asian countries, belief and faith in the United Nations and its various organizations. It talks of world peace, it talks of promoting democracy. All these principles have been there as part of the guiding framework for India's foreign policy from the very beginning. And it is here we find that both India's culture, India's tradition, India's traditional social moorings, they have come in a big way in basically influencing this type of framework of India's foreign policy. Now no one can deny the role of the individuals in formulation and in determining such framework for any country, whether India or any other country. And in this context, the first Prime Minister Nehru definitely played very important role, as I mentioned earlier, that basically it was his vision of a world, peaceful world, It was his vision of a democratic world, of course informed by the Gandhian legacy of non-violence, which made a lot of difference in formulation of India's foreign policy. Because as it is well known that when India was talking of this type of politics in world affairs, entire world was basically under the grip of Cold War, and human beings had already seen the two world wars, and therefore the clouds of the third world war on the horizon, political horizon. And therefore, in context of this Cold War, which essentially meant at that time arms race, which essentially meant the kind of bloc politics, and it essentially meant basically subjugating those countries which were poor, underdeveloped, and trying to come out of their backwardness, again to bring within this framework of power politics and deprive them of freedom, autonomy, and justice. Therefore, India's basically position at that time was quite vulnerable, because India realized, because it had fought a long battle against colonialism, and it believed that not only India but many countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America were placed in the similar position. Therefore, there were two choices: either to join one of these blocs and lose autonomy and freedom in decision making, lose basically the prospect of growing at one's own terms, and become subservient to this power politics. Or the alternative choice was to basically find out a new path, the third path, which was neither the path shown by the capitalist countries and the liberal, so-called the liberal world of the West, or the socialist and the communist bloc of the East led by the Soviet Union. So it was basically the quest for this third path which took India to this path of non-alignment, and that fitted nicely with engagement with soft power, because India from the very beginning was believing in this dimension, that how international politics, domestic politics, and all such things should be based on ethical norms and principles, not on simply the class power politics. So I mean, this was the context of India's engagement with this non-alignment. Now what happened, that this non-aligned movement was launched in 1961 in Belgrade, but before 1961 one finds that basically the ground was set for this movement, and this happened quite early on. For example, 1947 India organized Asian Relations Conference in Delhi. I think that during the time when India was very close to its independence, I think perhaps March 1947. And what happened, that the Asian Relations Conference was basically the first move on the part of the India to show that how India is trying to forge a larger solidarity of Asian countries in world politics. And this solidarity was meant essentially for bringing peace, democracy, and stability in world politics. Now after 1947, we find that there is another move, and this comes in 1955. This is the Bandung Conference, where you have not only Asian countries, but the African countries were also taken on board. So you have the Afro-Asian Conference, and this conference is known as the Bandung Conference of 1955. And now we find that these two, the Asian Relations Conference of 47 and the Afro-Asian Countries Conference of 1955, both of them graduating to this non-aligned movement in 1961 at Belgrade, where you have not only Asia, you don't have only Africa, but now you have also Latin America. So it becomes solidarity of Asian, African, and Latin American countries. Now the two things which were binding them together, one was that all these three continents had reeled under colonial rule for a long period of time, and number two, all these three continents and the countries were basically backward, where they had a quest for development. They wanted a place in the larger world politics. Therefore, this was essential bonding among these three types of three continents which we have just mentioned: Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now this non-aligned movement, therefore, at that time talked of two things, two important principles. It talked of disarmament and it talked of development. And these two principles, to some extent one can say that were the principles which are directly directed against the discourse of the Cold War, because Cold War essentially talked of arms race and armaments, and non-aligned movement talked of disarmament. Cold War wanted to divert the resources from development to armaments. The non-aligned movement wanted to divert the resources from armaments to development. So basically development and this disarmament were basically put as an alternative to this Cold War politics. Now basically this became not a kind of rhetoric for these third world countries, but these things became basically the part of the larger survival agenda of these countries. And along with this disarmament and development, they also talked of democratization of world polity, and essentially they meant the democratization of United Nations, because ultimately United Nations was the only organization through which the world peace could be thought of at that time. Now this democratization of world peace, world body called United Nations, ran essentially against the framework which was being practiced by the superpowers and the big powers at that time. Because what happened at the Security Council, which became the chamber through which these dominant powers of the world tried to dominate the world, I mean, countries like India always tried to democratize it by pushing most of the crucial decisions from Security Council to General Assembly, where all nation states had one vote. But that was not acceptable, and therefore non-aligned movement from the very beginning started as a movement for a democratization of world politics. It wanted to basically bring peace and stability in world politics. It wanted that all countries should grow, all countries should become developed, all countries should basically fulfill the aspirations of the people, and therefore its agenda was quite humane, its agenda was quite democratic, and therefore one can say that India became a leader of this grouping, the third world countries. It became a leader of the non-aligned movement, and therefore India not only brought its traditional values in this new framework of politics in world, in world affairs. Rather, it tried to create the new dimension to its traditional values. For example, the new dimension that how the in modern context, modern conditions, the politics can be governed by traditional values of peace, neutrality, non-violence, and harmony, diversity, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, this way one can see that India at that time tried to basically present this entire notion of soft power in form of non-aligned movement, and to great extent basically succeeded in not only protecting its own interests, but succeeded in providing to the world community a new framework for basically for engaging with politics. And therefore India's contribution in world politics is universally recognized. It is different matter that later on it was believed that non-aligned movement, instead of serving India's purpose, became a liability, but we will come on to this issue later. But initially it came as a discourse of soft power. It came as a kind of framework which was meant essentially to protect the interests of countries like India, which found themselves quite vulnerable in world politics, and therefore its utility and its significance must be acknowledged. Now the second issue which I mentioned was the Panchasheel. Now this emerged as a framework to deal with the bilateral relationship between India and China. Now it is, many of you must be knowing that how China and India both suffered at the hands of the colonial rulers, and how after getting independence both countries were aspiring for a new role in world politics. Now what happened that immediately after independence, when there was turmoil in the China and the nationalist forces were replaced by the communist movement in 1949, India was the first country which recognized China, and India also campaigned for its permanent seat in United Nations. Now because of two reasons, that Nehru as India's prime minister believed that China was India's neighbor and they had a traditional relationship, traditional bonding, and that should be honored and that should be used for promoting regional security, regional stability, and regional peace. And at the same time this should be presented to the world community, that how two big neighbors can coexist on peaceful terms and still they can progress. So this was a kind of basically understanding behind this approach towards this neighbor China, and it was the culmination of this approach that we find that in 1954 India basically, while signing a treaty with China, recognized China's sovereignty over Tibet, and entered into a new discourse of engagement, and which later on became famous as the principle of Panchasheel. Now this Panchasheel had 5 principles. Now those 5 principles were: number 1, peaceful coexistence; number 2, the mutual respect for territory and sovereignty of the country, and third was the mutual non-aggression. The fourth was mutual non-interference in the internal affairs of states, and fifth was basically equality, mutual benefit, and peaceful existence between these two neighbors. So these 5 principles, which became the preamble of this new treaty, and later on it was called the Panch principle of Panchasheel. I mean, these 5 principles are essentially meant to govern the bilateral relationship between the two neighbors. But at the same time, this was a demonstration to the larger world that how these 5 principles can be principle for peaceful coexistence of the entire world community, not between only India and China. And therefore, what was being done here was not simply governing the bilateral relationship between two neighbors, but what was being done here was to show the entire world community that how India still believes in these principles, which may be looking as traditional principles, but these principles are important for basically governing the world society. Now, it was under this discourse that what we find that India tried to surge ahead in the world politics. Now, what happened later, interestingly, that these principles of 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, as known as Panchasheel, didn't basically survive for long, because as I don't, it is not possible here to go into the details that how that relationship between India and China deteriorated later, and ultimately resulted into 1962 aggression, which came as a great jolt to the architect of this Panchasheel, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who was India's first Prime Minister. And therefore, after 1962, what we find that this came as a jolt to the policymakers here, and there was a kind of reassessment of this soft power. That can India exist with the soft power, or should India move in direction of the normal power or the hard power, or kind of the power which basically other countries of the world practice. And therefore, what we find that after 64, essentially, India started moving in direction of this normal power, that is basically focused on the military strength, focused on the institutional matrix of power, started focusing on number of things which it believed that India had ignored under the spell of this morality, ethics, and the discourse of soft power in earlier era. And therefore, India suffered, India's national interest suffered, India's economy suffered, India's standing in the world affairs suffered, and therefore there was a shift in direction of this normal power. So 64 onwards, you have a new engagement. Now, this new engagement can be basically seen in terms of India's growing focus on nuclear weapons, and therefore you find that 1974 you had the first Pokhran explosion, but still it was a peaceful, the entire discourse was for the peaceful purposes. It was not for weaponization or not for military purposes. But nonetheless, India recognized the importance of the nuclear weapons. Of course, India's engagement in nuclear weapons didn't start in 74. In fact, Nehru-Bhabha discourse, which is normally put that way, Homi Bhabha, who was the architect of India's nuclear policy, Bhabha's stature as a great scientist of repute was internationally acclaimed and recognized, and therefore he became the chairman of the first atomic energy conference. But the thing is that India never thought in terms of nuclear option, because it always believed in peace, it always believed in kind of world order which will be totally devoid of or basically away from this type of arms race, because India always talked of disarmament, always talked of development, and he never believed in arms race. But 1964 onwards, India is slightly moving from its pure engagement with soft power and trying to harmonize the soft power and the hard power, normal power. And that way one can say that India's own experience is basically trying to take it in direction of this new engagement. Now, what happened that 74 you have the first nuclear explosion, Pokhran 1, and then one should remember that for next 24 years India waited, because the second nuclear explosion happens only in 98. But there is a difference, because 98 onwards India moves in direction of weaponization and nuclear doctrine. But 74 was a little bit different, but it was only a kind of a statement in world politics that India is not totally oblivious of the importance of the normal power and hard power. Secondly, even in non-aligned movement, what many scholars and experts of non-aligned movement, they believe that the radicalization of non-aligned movement started. instead of taking simply a neutral stand vis-a-vis the two power blocs, what happened that post 64, particularly in 70, a radicalization took place and it started tilting in direction of the East, the Soviet bloc, and it became a kind of anti-West platform of many countries, including India. So, I mean, these digressions, people believe that was basically well considered thing, because at times, it was realized that only soft power engagement cannot take India in the, towards its mission of a more respectable place in world politics. So, I mean, this engagement with both hard power and soft power now was continuing. I mean, both were trying to be harmonized, that how they can complement each other. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, that it is normally believed that both powers are required for each other. Neither hard power or normal power can exist without the soft power, nor soft power can survive with the backup of the hard power, because ultimately the hegemony, the entire concept of hegemony, that how the consent, how basically the authority, it turned into a kind of a legitimate authority only through number of means, and therefore this combination of hard and soft are very important. Now, what happened that this discourse combination of hard and soft was continuing, but in the meanwhile some important development took place in 90s, and that was the end of the Cold War. And end of Cold War signaled a new development in the world politics, because India's independence, India's engagement with the soft power, entire non-aligned movement, all these things were basically the part of this larger discourse in the world politics, which was basically being governed by the conditions created by this Cold War politics. Now, suddenly this end of Cold War created a vacuum in the world politics, and therefore many countries started redefining, reassessing the world situation, including India. And it was basically this reassessment and it kind of the basically re-engagement to the new situation, which has led to the creation of a new framework under which India is basically trying to move ahead with this engagement with the soft power. And therefore, the 21st century, as I mentioned, that India's role is globally acknowledged, that India is basically kind of privileged to have few things which other countries don't have. Even India's Prime Minister recently mentioned three factors, that democracy and the kind market and the demographic dividends, the three things which India has at the moment, even China doesn't have. For example, China doesn't have democracy. It may have a market, it may have demand, but it doesn't have democracy. Similarly, the democratic dividends, the population, the younger population, the productive population, which India has, but no other country has. Therefore, there are certain advantages, and India basically wants to take advantage of this, takes advantage of this situation and moves ahead and creates a new place, a more basically non-antagonistic, non-conflictual, non-coercive and non-violent space for itself in world politics. And this can be possible only by basically again banking on, or rather basically invoking traditional values, ethical values, and tying up them or harmonizing them with the new face of India's hard power, that is economic growth, its military might, because India is de facto a nuclear nation. It is not part of the nuclear club, but it has the nuclear capability. So it is believed that India is a de facto nuclear power. So, I mean, even in terms of the hard power, it is believed that India is now basically a privilege to have all those elements, all those dimensions which can make any country respectable in world politics. Now, how this respectability can be further augmented, how this respectability can be further basically fine-tuned with the help of the soft power, this is perhaps the crucial issue at this moment of time in our history, that is 21st century. And therefore, India's entire policy discourse in world politics entering into new phase. And this new phase is characterized by India's new engagement with soft power. The new engagement means that the old traditional framework of soft power is not totally abandoned, but that is fine-tuned. Now, how it can be fine-tuned? Now, let us start with non-alignment. Now, it is believed that non-aligned movement served India's interest nicely for many years. But now in today's context, non-aligned movement is not appropriate for India's foreign policy, because it is a liability. Because now instead of leading the entire third world bloc, turning it to in the third, trade unionism of the third world country. India can protect its interests better if it bilaterally engages with the big powers, engages with neighbors, and basically this leading this third world bloc will not be effective in protecting India's interests. So this debate is going on the issue of non-aligned movement. Many people believe, many experts believe, many countries believe that non-aligned movement is irrelevant in today's context. But of course there are other opinions also. They believe that non-aligned movement is not irrelevant, that is still relevant. India has a traditional resource in form of non-aligned movement, and it should be fine-tuned, restructured, and should be used again as a soft power discourse for promoting India's interests in global affairs. Now coming to this Panchasheel, now India-China engagement is again entering into new phase. Now of course there are two types of opinion. One opinion is that India and China, they have certain interests which put them in two different conflicting blocks or two conflicting situations. But another opinion which says that India and China can collaborate, can compete but still collaborate, and thereby both of them can grow and create a new framework, can create a new example for the world politics, that how these neighbors can have certain conflict of interest, but still there are scope, there are possibilities through which they can be basically arbitrated, they can be negotiated, and they can be settled, and therefore peace and stability in their mutual relationship can be a new example. Now in recent years we have seen that both countries have border disputes, have number of disputes on number of issues, but still the dialogue is continuing, and dialogue is one of the most important instrument for promoting soft power. So I mean, this way we can see that this Panchasheel may have may not have survived for long, but with this new engagement between India and China, we find that these two countries are again moving in that direction, that how this new engagement can be another example for the world community. So I mean, these two things we should remember that are re-emerging, re-entering in this discourse of soft power, non-alignment and Panchasheel, of course in a changed context. It cannot be used in the same form, they have to be fine-tuned, they have to be restructured, but its importance as an ethical framework of politics, they are still recognized as very important instruments and contributions for India, from the point of view of India. Now apart from these two things, there are other channels through which this engagement with soft power can be actualized. For example, there are a number of cultural instruments. Now, for example, the Indian people, a lot of experts have started talking of Indian movie, the Bollywood. People have started talking of the sports like cricket. People have started, experts have started discussing about a skilled manpower, the possibility of a skilled manpower exporting from India. India can export a skilled manpower to the entire world. Experts have started talking of Indian diaspora in the entire world, which is very important. At least United States and Europe, I mean, this diaspora is very significant. They are playing very important role in their social life, and how this diaspora can also be used to basically promote India's image in the world politics, because soft power is ultimately meant to create a kind of situation where the image of a particular nation state becomes more favorable, becomes more acceptable, becomes more attractive, and therefore the diaspora, the tourism. So I mean, these are the other instruments which are also now being looked at, that how these instruments can be used to basically create a new framework for this discourse of soft power. Now what I am basically also finding that apart from this engagement with the soft power, apart from this entire attempt to basically reconfigure this Indo-China relationship in the framework of old Panchasheel of peaceful coexistence, how India is trying to basically reach out to those countries who are basically in the forefront of this non-aligned movement and try to create new framework within the broader framework of non-aligned movement. For example, number of smaller blocks have been created, and those blocks are playing very important role in world politics. One such block is IBSA, India, Brazil and South Africa, the three countries coming together and creating a kind of a block, not a power block, but a kind of grouping to engage with the world community. Now, 3 countries are very significant. They are the third world countries. They are basically, all 3 countries have democratic form of government, and that provides some sort of homogeneity and cohesiveness to this bloc. South Africa, India and Brazil. Similarly, there are other formations which necessarily do not fit into this non-aligned framework. For example, RICS, Russia, India, China, or BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. All these groupings are there. They are essentially meant to engage with the new situation in world politics, where you have the global market as a very important instrument for organizing and governing the world. You have many institutions like World Trade Organization. You have many institutions which are there to basically govern this world economic growth and trade. So I mean, these important blocks are there, groupings are there, but at least some of them, like I mentioned, IBSA, India, Brazil and South Africa, one can associate with the traditional non-aligned movement. Even non-aligned movement at times moved in direction of smaller groups to basically engage with the larger community, and therefore one must remember here the group of 77 or G77 was created within non-aligned movement. So I mean, these smaller blocks are also basically indicator that how not only on pure engagement with this normative power or the soft power, but even harmonizing it with this understanding of hard power, I think are the important moments in India's engagement with the world politics today. And therefore one can say that there is not only revival of interest, there is not only a kind of reconfiguring the entire framework which existed earlier, but in fact the attempt is also being made to creatively harness it for serving India's national interest at this point of time. So I think this we can say that this new discourse of the soft power from the point of view of India is going to be very significant in coming years and decades. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a very engaging lecture, and I would just like to briefly ask you, say, today's topic, if a student wants to study more in depth about this, what would be, could you suggest a book or any other avenue they can consult or perhaps read about to learn more about this topic?
Yeah, in fact, there are a number of literature available for discussion on this theme, but in fact this the soft power discourse is a new basically feature of India's foreign policy in recent years. Earlier it was there, but one can find some issues of journal seminar. One can find few books like Raja Mohan, Shumit Ganguly and others who have recently written.
Okay.
One can find also some of the interesting papers in Pratap Bhanu Mehta and Sunil Khilrani edited a book on India's foreign policy.
Right.
So there are a number of edited volumes, there are a number of journals where a lot of scholars have reflected on this theme. So those who want to pursue it further,
absolutely,
for them there are number of
number of books, number of sources if they want to study.
Yeah.
And so this idea or this particular topic, is it also now being taught within the class? Is it part of the lectures, or is it relatively new that it has not been incorporated?
No, gradually it is now entering into the curriculum of many universities and many academic discourses and engagements, because globally it is recognized that the soft power, without soft power, in fact this hard power cannot have a long life.
Absolutely.
That is globally recognized. India is in a slightly advantageous position because other countries are realizing it now.
Right.
But India from the very beginning basically crafted its entire foreign policy based on this realization.
Right, right.
So I mean, that way India should be happy that India recognizes this dimension early on.
Right. So you also mentioned the non-aligned movement, and then you talked about Panchsheel.
Yeah.
So is it true that these systems are being brought about again within the government?
Yeah, in fact I didn't have much time to go into the detail, but what happened that India's entire foreign policy became synonymous with non-aligned movement for a very long period of time.
Right.
But then it was realized later that it was not serving India's interests the way it served it earlier. and therefore the debate started.
Right.
That should India continue this non-aligned framework, or should India think in terms of something else?
Absolutely.
Particularly, as I mentioned, this Cold War ended, and non-aligned movement was considered to be creation of Cold War politics. So many people started arguing that if the context has disappeared, then why to have this framework?
Definitely.
But now it is being realized that Cold War might have disappeared, but the conditions created by Cold War are still continuing. Therefore, justification for non-alignment has not totally disappeared.
Right.
So that is there. And Panchashila, as I mentioned, that it was a great visionary, formulation, a declaration on the part of India and China, but basically it didn't survive long. And I mentioned 62 Chinese aggression led to kind of end of this. But now in the new context, when China and India again emerging in a big way on world stage, now it is believed that how these two countries can basically govern their bilateral relationship.
Right.
And it is in this context experts have started arguing that the old concept of Panchashila should be revived for governing their bilateral relationship, where they can compete. They have their own national interests. Right. They are the sovereign nation states, so they can compete.
Absolutely.
But that competition shouldn't lead to any conflict.
True.
There should be collaboration also, because there are a number of interests where their interests become kind of coterminous. Their overlapping of interests. So I mean, they can coexist, they can collaborate, and they can create a kind of framework which can be a lesson for the entire world community, that how two neighbors can basically function in this peaceful manner.
Absolutely.
So therefore this value of Panchashila is again being recognized.
And it might be revived. Also.
I mean, the old spirit might be revived.
Right. And so then we can say that soft power is an advantageous in that sense to our system, and that it should be revived.
Oh yes, definitely, because
it is being
we have the traditional resources. We have our culture based on the principle of peace and harmony.
Yes.
We have a diverse social situation.
Absolutely.
Where a number of religions, languages, ethnic groups, so on and so forth. Diverse country.
Yes.
We have a political philosophy given by Gandhi, non-violence, which is recognized world over as a very important instrument in politics.
Definitely.
So we have the resources, and therefore we can basically harness those resources to make this engagement with soft power more effective and more useful for the world.
Absolutely. So thank you very much by giving us this clear insight into the idea of soft power in world politics within the Indian discourse, and I would like to thank you again for being here, sparing your valuable time, and thank you so much, viewers. Have a great day.